All right, good evening for everybody. I'm Mike Hall. I'm the executive director through Rangers Foundation, which most of you must be familiar with. You wouldn't have gotten the word on this Zoom. Normally one of the five lines of operation for the Ranger for Life program is financial wellness, and this is the brief that pretty much that we've been giving at the symposiums, which we uh, basically run once a George cycle for each of the Ranger battalions. We've been doing it sort of kind of mostly since about 2020, and it's gotten into a good rhythm now. Tonight, Jeff Wright, and I'll let him introduce himself, but he's going to give a brief on basically the brief, which of course we continue to modify that we give at each of the seminars on financial wellness. We started this project a long time ago. The financial brief was put together by about 20 former Rangers that had gotten out of the Army and became financial advisors across a bunch of different disciplines and developed a financial wellness plan that it was developed by Rangers, for Rangers and Ranger families and Ranger spouses that we thought, you always want to know your audience. So, these guys served in the regiment, understand the training cycle, the deployment cycle, understand the finances of the folks in the organization. So we think it specifically applies to this group of people. But the focus is on sound financial practices, and some of you veterans out here will obviously recognize them, rather than specific investment advice. It's designed to provide valuable financial guidance without dictating how to spend or invest your money. One thing we don't do is obviously we don't tell people how to invest their money. You probably all have sat through those briefings, if especially if you're an older guy, you sat through those briefings where somebody came in the day room and basically was from this company or that company and basically sold you a product. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to just tell people the basics of financial wellness and guide people in the right way. It's if you're in the service, you really don't think about it a lot, and of course, this brief is really directed at once you get out of the service, and how to use your money. And so, most leaders in the Army really can't explain that to you because they're still in the Army and they haven't experienced it. So, I really appreciate it of Jeff Wright, who took this project on about 4 or 5 years ago and has continued to improve upon it. And Jeff, I'll let you specifically introduce this will be recorded. It'll go on our website. It'll be distributed to the battalion, so it'll always be out there. And Jeff, I'll let you introduce yourself. And again, thanks for all you do giving back to Rangers.
Yeah, thanks, Sound Major. Appreciate it. Yeah, so this is basically the same as we present to the battalions when we go there, like Sergeant Major said. And ultimately, the approach or the goal is that, for all of us, our finances, the goal is for that to be a resource to accomplish what we want to accomplish in life, right? So our finances are a resource, and we want them to not be a constraint. Too often, finances and bad finances in particular influence decisions and what we're trying to do a little bit disproportionately. And everyone's in a different situation. Everybody's circumstances are different. However, there are some fundamental basics that are basically universal, right? And that's sort of the angle or the approach that we're going. So I'll pull up the presentation here. We call it Ranger Financial Readiness. It matches the lingo. You call it financial wellness as well, financial health, all those things. When it comes to the terminology, specifically wellness, the idea is to be able to thrive, right? Not just survive, not just sort of be healthy and get through it, but really be in a position to thrive. So I'll tell you all about me here in just a second, but here's sort of the approach that we take. Set the conditions, execute, and then assess and resource. So setting conditions is basically the planning portion, right? If you think about an operation, you go through the planning process. And that's what this is, where we say, hey, what are the things that we can control? A lot of the times it's behaviors and disciplines, really, that we can attack to put us in a position for success as we move into the future. Execute is a lot of the nuts and bolts, right? We'll get into the ideas of things like budgeting or the investment process and type of accounts and insurance and things of that nature. That's the execution piece. And then assessing and resourcing is really evaluating how am I doing? Am I on track? And what are the resources out there that can help me along the way and keep me educated? And that's what we'll talk about providing today as well. So just a little bit of background here, like Sergeant Major said, I was in the Army. I was a fire support officer in Delta Company 175, 1st Battalion, back when the battalions had a line company in 2008, 2009. I left the Army and went and got an MBA, and I've been in the wealth management industry since 2012. Spent several years at Merrill Lynch, so kind of big bank environment, learning the industry, and then went independent. Now I have my own wealth management firm, Right Wealth LLC. Meanwhile, like Sergeant Major said a few years ago, I got involved back into the Ranger specifically community, just by way of things like this. And for me, this what's awesome about this, or why I love doing this, is it's being part of the team again, right? Being it's part of the culture. And one of the things I always mention, even though this isn't a cultural transition brief, is the importance of staying connected to the community and around other Rangers. Because when I left active duty, there wasn't a Three Rangers Foundation. And so one day I was a tan beret wearing Ranger, and the next day I was a nobody. And that's not true. I had a career and I had a family and things like that, but that was a huge part of me that was missing until I got reconnected. So especially when we go to the units, it's just awesome for me to be able to walk in there and be part of the team again. Couple of house cleaning items, Sergeant Major alluded to them, but when I talk about these kind of aspirational financial things, there are two things that aren't a part of this discussion. So I mentioned I run my own firm, but the first one is that this is not a sales pitch, right? I actually don't sell any products anyway. I'm a fiduciary and just basically give advice, but that's not what the intent of this is for. And then the second is I'm not going to tell you how to spend your money. That's what Sergeant Major mentioned, right? Because most people think of financial advice as, all right, let me see your LES or your pay stub, and don't be buying coffee, right? Don't go to Starbucks every day. And that's not it. Really, it's about understanding your position, setting your priorities, and making sure that you're living with and in accordance with those priorities and those goals. And we're all on a journey, right? I like to show this map here from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the government organization, and it's sort of the military path, right? Everybody goes into the military, they go to basic, they come out, they go to their unit, they're going to go through some time of acclimation, might get promoted, might get deployed, might ETS or PCS, and then eventually at some point they're going to get out of the military, whether it's an ETS or retirement. But the point here is this: for all of us, we can sort of look forward down that map into the future and think about the things that we need to position for and plan for. In this case, from a financial perspective, right? Just like map reading, you have to identify where you are, you have to identify where you're going, and then you plan your route along the way. And so this is to get people thinking about, okay, what do I have coming up? Is it going to be a PCS? Am I going to have to sell a house, and am I going to have to buy a new one at my new station? Or if I'm getting out of the Army, am I going into another career? What do I need to do financially to prepare for finding a new job or going back to school or starting a business or whatever the case may be? Maybe it's family considerations along the way. I'm going to have kids or things of that nature. Those are all things we can sort of anticipate. No one knows what the future holds specifically, but we can anticipate those things. And this is where it gets to that idea of setting the conditions, because we can prepare ourselves or put ourselves in the position that at each of those kind of waypoints, we're on track to what we want. In terms of for the active duty Rangers, what I tell them is, everybody's going to get out of the military. Everyone's going to reach the end of their enlistment. And what we want finances to do is to support what they actually want to do. In other words, I don't want a Ranger to be in a situation where they love serving their country, they love serving in the regiment, They would love to continue a career in it, but they're just up to their ears in debt. And the only way out is to go back to the family business where they're going to make more money on paper, right? Don't want that to be the case. On the other side of that, don't want it to be the case where someone has loved their service. They would like to get out and start a business, but here again, financially, they're not able to do that, and therefore they have to stay in and not pursue their other dreams, but they feel stuck in the army, right? If we do the right things along the way, then we're equipped to make the best decision for us because those finances are now a resource to support that rather than a limiter that's going to, drive us where we don't want to go effectively. So here are the things we think about defining success. What does that look like? Right? We can't do anything. We can't do any plans. We can't do any processes or disciplines or investments or anything if we don't know what success looks like. That might be something like retiring. That might be something like getting out of debt. What is that point of success in the scope of someone's overall kind of plan? Positioning yourself as what are the things that I do along the way to get towards that success as I've defined it. And then implementing is the execution. Another way to think about finances is not unlike really anything in life worth pursuing. So if we think about, hey, one day I'd like to get, a degree, I pursue an education, that doesn't happen overnight, right? You have to research the schools, you have to, take exams in preparation, you have to apply, you get accepted, you have to register, you have to take the courses, you have to pass the test, and you take the next course. It's just a process you have to go through, and at the end of it, you come out with a degree. Same thing with fitness, right? If I'm going to run a marathon and I've never ran, I'm not going to wake up on day one and run 26.2 miles. I'm going to start with 1 mile, put together a plan. I'm going to define success as being able to run that full distance. And then I'm going to put myself in the position to be able to do it by building up along the way. Even if you think about a military operation, right? You don't show up to your unit after RASP 1 and go right into an MLAT typically, right? We're gonna go through individual skills training, and we're gonna go through team drills, and we're gonna go through squad drills, and on, and build upon that so that the skill set builds towards that ultimate goal of being able to close with and destroy the enemy. So all these things, ultimately, we are all a sum of our behaviors every single day, and that's what this is designed to give us to think through: is what is success and what do I got to do to get there. So some of the execution pieces here, budgeting. So again, it's not in my practice to tell people how to spend their money. I don't look at people's checkbooks or that sort of thing. But budgeting or running a budget is an extremely critical exercise to run, right? And ultimately, what that means is taking a look at what you've been spending on. So just run an audit of the last month or 2 months of your spending so you recognize what you're spending on, because there are things you may not even know, right? So you got to know where the money goes if you want it to go where you want it to work for you. And this is where I go back to the coffee example, right? So there's nothing wrong with going to Starbucks, whenever you want and getting a cup of coffee. We all run on coffee, right? But the difference is if you look at a budget and say, all right, how much have I spent at Starbucks over the past 30 days? And it's some astronomical number that you have no idea. Well, that might be an indication to you, if you look at that surprise, that I can cut back on that without even missing it, because now I want to be more aligned with my priorities, right? So if the idea is what can I position in the future by creating discretionary income today or extra income today, and either saving it or investing it or paying down debt, well, you have to track everything to know where the dollars are to make those adjustments, right? So like anything else, progress is made through measurement. And that's why that's such a valuable exercise. And then ultimately, you make those adjustments based on what you have defined as your own priorities for success. Pension versus the blended retirement system. This is for folks that were either in one or the other. A lot of times, people ask questions about this that were sort of in that middle ground where they had to choose. Only thing I like to highlight here is that there are benefits to both. A lot of more recent active duty service members, think they kind of got screwed by the blended retirement system because the pension is less. And the pension is less. However, the government has adjusted for that by adding a match into TSP contributions, which is free money, right? So actuarially or statistically speaking, the break-even value mathematically, and it's all based on assumptions, obviously, is about the same between the old pension and a reduced pension plus a match that compounds over time. So I just like to point that out to people. The benefit, the real benefit is if I don't stay in the Army 20 years to retire, but I've gotten the match, I get to keep that match versus in the old system, I had to stay in the full 20 just to get any of that retirement benefit. Right. And that goes back to when it comes to the active duty Rangers, that goes back to, okay, cool. My situation, here's what that means. And here's what we do. And we'll talk a little bit about investing in the investment process, particularly when it comes to structures and accounts and things like that. So I just talked about the blended retirement system. Big thing here is uh, that service members need to make sure that they're contributing at least 5% to get that match. And then the second piece of that is making sure that they actually have an investment selected rather than just sitting in the G fund, which is basically cash. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But when it comes to that, whether it's a TSP or any sort of investment account, and we'll talk about the differences, is here's the big takeaway. Like we have access to the capital market system in America and it can work for us. So we've all seen, kind of compounding charts, and I think we all understand the power of compounding. But to see it in a situation like this, you've probably seen things similar before. But this is just the power of, investing just a little bit over the course of 20 years. You're going to wind up having invested even more than you put into it, right? So, and that spread between the purple and the pink there just grows over time because the more you have compounded, the faster it compounds upon itself. Um, so this is just to show that the power of it is there. And this assumes, by the way, this scenario here of $3,000 a year assumes no pay raises, or in the case of active duty, no step increases or promotions or anything like that. This is just a straight $3,000 a year over 20 years. When you account for increased contributions and increased raises, then this number gets pretty large pretty quick. So from an execution perspective, we're going to talk about the different type of accounts, right? Because if we go back to the overarching idea of planning, what are my goals and what do I want to accomplish? When it comes to the execution piece, it's resourcing each of those goals, right? So I might say, I want to retire in 20 years, hang it up and ride off into the sunset. There are certain financial things that you need to be doing between now and those 20 years to position yourself at that point in time. Retirement accounts is being an obvious one. But there may be other goals in the meantime. I may be buying a house in 5 years. I may be starting a business in 3 years. I may be, my family may be growing over the next couple of years. I may be retiring and going back to school in 10 years, right? Those are all different goals that you need to prepare for differently. And the important part about what we're talking about here on this slide is the type of account that you're saving into, because that's ultimately what it's about. Is you create discretionary income, put it into one of these accounts to save, and then hopefully invest so that they grow between now and the time of that goal. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of accounts. So one thing to keep in mind is that there are retirement accounts and there are taxable accounts. I'll talk about the taxable in a second. Most people find that a little bit scary, but it actually has its benefits. When it comes to retirement accounts, there are two sort of flavors or kinds, and then there are two tax treatments, right? So the two flavors are employer sponsored, which is TSP or 401k or 403b on the nonprofit side, and those are employer sponsored plans, which means that the employer for TSP is the government manages that plan, right? Then there's individual retirement accounts, which means you go to a brokerage firm and the individual manages that account on their own. Okay, so those are effectively the same from a tax treatment perspective. The difference is you have a lot more control on an IRA than you do in a 401k. But those are effectively the same. You can think of these types of accounts as buckets. So I have a bucket, that's my TSP or my 401k. You can put things in that bucket, right? The bucket itself doesn't have any implication as to whether it's good or not. Sometimes I hear comments like my 401k is terrible or my TSP sucks or something like that. Well, really, it's what you put in there that makes the difference. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And then the IRA is just a bucket. You can put all kinds of things there. And then a taxable account, whether it's an individual or a joint, just a typical brokerage account, you can put anything in there. Now, on that end, the taxable, like I mentioned, it has its advantage. And the advantage is that while you may pay a little bit of taxes each year through dividends, interest, and capital gains, though it's going to be pretty minuscule in the big picture of things, typically, unless you're very, very wealthy. But the benefit is that you don't have to wait till you're 59 and a half to access that asset, right? If it's a retirement account, you typically have to wait till you're 59 and a half. Otherwise, you may wind up paying taxes and penalties. So that sort of ties it up. So that just brings it all back to, okay, what's the type of account that we have? And then how do I plan for each of those? Because if I'm 40 and I'm retiring at the age of 60, but I'm buying a house in 5 years, well, I don't want to pour every dollar into my 401k or TSP because that can't buy a house, right? I can't buy a house with those assets that are tied up. Back to the retirement side, again, this is the tax treatment. So it applies to both TSP or 401k and IRA. So if the two are just buckets that act the same, the tax treatment from the IRS's perspective can be the same between them too. And there are the two tax treatments. There's pre-tax, or what's called qualified. And this has been around for a long time, where you put a dollar into that account, whether it's qualified TSP, 401k, or a traditional IRA, and that reduces your taxable income in that year. So if I make $50,000 and I put $5,000 into an IRA or into a 401k, then I'm only taxed on $45,000 that year. It grows into the future, and I'm taxed when I take it out of that IRA or TSP or 401k after the age of 60, and it's taxed at my income tax rate at that time. Okay, so the Roth is the opposite. Roth is whatever I put in there, I don't get a tax deduction. So I put $5,000 into a Roth IRA. I'm still going to get taxed on all $50,000 of salary in that year and pay income tax on it. But then it grows post-tax, or tax-free is a way to think of it. It's not completely tax-free because you did pay income tax, but it grows tax-free until you withdraw from it at the age of 60. And then whatever you take out, there's no taxes for that, right? So which one should someone do? They should evaluate when they expect their income tax rate to be higher, and that should be the determinant. Here's what I mean by that. So simple examples: if I'm 18 years old and I have my first job, I'm not making a whole lot of money, I'm going to be in a low income tax bracket, then I need to be piling into Roth, maxing out all my Roth accounts, because I'm not paying a lot of taxes anyways. And presumably in 50 years, I'm going to be very wealthy in a high income tax bracket, and I'd rather just take it out tax free at that point because I'll be in a higher tax bracket. The other side of that is if I'm mid career or senior in my career and I'm in a very high tax bracket because I have a high salary, well, then I want to maximize qualified or pre-tax accounts to reduce that taxable income when my tax rate is high. And then when I'm retired, I'm no longer working that high salary job, I may be in a lower income tax bracket, and then I'll rather pay that tax. No one has a crystal ball, but that's the way to think of it. By the way, a quick housekeeping note: I see a couple questions in the chat, so I will get to those at the end. So I won't forget about that. So let's talk about the investment process here. So I like to show this to demonstrate kind of the way to think about what's available in the TSP, but I'm also showing the equivalent investment that is available outside of the TSP, because they're effectively the same. The best example to think about is the C fund. The C fund is the S&P 500, right? So the 500 largest companies publicly traded in the U.S. economy or the U.S. stock markets. That's the C fund. That's available in a number of index funds that you could buy in an individual account, a taxable account, or an IRA. And one of the symbols or tickers is SPY. So in other words, the C fund and SPY are an index fund of those 500 companies, and they're exactly the same. Right. So this is pointing out that it's what you put into that TSP that really makes the difference, or what you put into, or what you invest in the IRA or a taxable account, that makes the difference. The S fund in the S&P 500 is smaller companies, in the US economy, and the I fund are international companies or companies that are publicly traded but are domiciled outside of the US. And then their corresponding equivalent index funds that you could buy in a brokerage account. S fund is the same as IWM, and then the I fund is the same as EFA. Those are two examples, and there's many of them, of low cost index funds that accomplish the same thing. It's pretty well known that the higher risk that you take, your higher expected return can be. It's not guaranteed, but the potential is there. The way to think about with these is that the I fund is the most risky. The S or smaller companies is the next most risky, and then the C fund or the larger companies are a little bit less risky. These are all stocks, and the stock market is considered a risky asset because it could be down 50% in a year, right? Which we've seen a number of times, and most recently in financial crisis, and even in COVID, it was down about 45% in a matter of weeks. So that's considered a risky asset. On the other end of the spectrum, you have bonds or bond funds, and in the TSP, you have the G fund, which is treasury bonds, short-term treasury bonds, basically cash. And then you have the F fund, which is all of the bonds in the entire US bond market, also known as the Barclays aggregate. And then you have the ticker there, AGG. So, what do I do with all this? The biggest determinant to someone's risk tolerance or risk factor is time horizon, right? So, the longer the time horizon, the more risk you can take because you have time to recover from those drawdowns. And those drawdowns will occur. They're perfectly normal. So even as we saw last week, media is freaking out about a quick decline. That is just normal stock market behavior. It's just going to happen. That's why it's considered risky. But if I have 10, 20, 30 years to ride it out, then history tells us that over time, that's going to be a higher returning investment as long as you allow it to continue to recover and then build upon itself. On the other end of the spectrum, with bonds or really safe bonds like treasuries, they're not going to earn a whole lot, but they're going to be very stable in price, right? So you're not going to be down 50% and lose half of that balance or whatever the case may be. If I have a very short time horizon, that's where bonds or cash comes into play, right? An emergency fund is an example of a short time horizon. Everybody should have 3 months of expenses saved in cash or a high yield savings or money market because that's time horizon zero. If I have an emergency, I have to get to that immediately, and I can't afford for it to be down 50%. Right? If I'm retired living off of my portfolio or my assets, that's basically time horizon zero also. And that's what happened during the financial crisis to people that had retired in the mid 2000s, and they had their stock portfolios and their real estate and their vacation homes and all these sort of things, which are all risky assets. And then when the economy tanked and stocks were down 50%, well, so is their entire balance sheet. And that was no longer enough to support their retirement because all they had was stocks and real estate. Now, if they had had some safer things like bonds and treasuries, they may not have made up as much money before 2007 when the decline started and in 2008, but they wouldn't have been down as much and they would have been able to stick with it and recover, right? So again, that's based on time horizon. If it's 10, 20, 30 years from now, it can be kind of high risk. The L funds or target date funds is what they're called. And again, they're available in brokerage accounts or IRAs or basically any 401k has these target date funds. Is just a mix of those other 5 funds that we've discussed, such that the longer the time period, so 2050 or 2060, is going to be higher risk or higher allocation to those stock funds. And that's just an easy way to do it. They're diversified across them all. And as it gets closer to that target date, it becomes more and more invested in the bond side, meaning that it basically reduces that risk as you get to it, right? So for active duty service members, especially early in their enlistment or their career, pick that target date that you're planning to retire. And by retire, I mean retire to the point that you need it, right? If I'm retiring from the Army in 2040, but I'm going to go work somewhere else and I'm not going to retire until 2050 or 60, then pick a longer one. But that's a good way to do it or think about it. As we zoom back out to our overall planning and where to invest assets and how to invest assets. Again, we go back to those goals of what we define success as, and your retirement account is going to have some subsets of these or these strategies in terms of being aggressive in stocks or not, and then whether it's emergency savings or short or intermediate term goals might be some mix, right? So that's the way to think of it. This is just sort of an FYI for the service members. It's kind of counterintuitive, but you change the contributions to your TSP in MyPay, but you change what the investments actually are in the TSP, right? So this is very important because if we go back to this slide here, a service member's TSP defaults to the G fund, which means they could be 19 years old and contributing to it, and it's just going to sit in cash. You have to proactively go in and change it to one of the other funds or one of the life cycle funds. So that's why I point that out, because it doesn't happen in the same place that you put your contributions, which is through MyPay. You got to do it. It's sort of a two-step process, but an important one, because again, this is where I've seen a lot of, well, my TSP has done nothing. Well, that's because it's not actually invested. So the next iteration of the execution piece. So like I mentioned at the beginning, personal circumstances are different. Everybody's financial situation is different, but there are a series of fundamentals that no one can promise or guarantee, but I would suggest if you do these type of things, you're going to be on a good trajectory. So this is designed effectively in such a way that you can hand it to any new ranger coming into the unit out of RASP 1 and say, hey, are you doing these things? Because these are the things that are going to set you on a trajectory to financial success, right? This is very basic. This is designed in 3 levels. There's basic, intermediate, and advanced, and I'll show you what those look like here in a second. But the idea is, no matter who you are, do you have 3 months of expenses saved in a cash, FDI insured, or money market account? If the answer is no, then you go back to that budget and identify money to start putting into that so that your emergency savings, that time zero money, is provided for. Okay, I have that set up. All right, now let's look at your TSP. Is it set up for at least 10%? If not higher, go into MyPay and turn on that 10%. By the way, usually, especially if someone's just showing up to the unit or if you're just moving or starting a job, before you get settled into a lifestyle, turning this on for a 10 or 15% contribution is wise, because you're not going to miss it, right? If you put it to 0, so you're taking home 100% less taxes, and then you're spending all of it, then it feels like a step back to turn that on. So very early on, let's turn that on to at least 10%, if not 15. An overall savings rate across all accounts, I like to see around 20%. Right? So if you're not there, that's okay. Figure out how you can start to get there and iteratively work your way up there. But in this case, is 10% turned on? If not, go turn it on, because you already have the emergency savings fund. You've identified some discretionary income to do that. So then go turn it on. Next thing, have you actually picked the investments like we talked about the last slide? If the answer is no, go to TSP, change it to one of those life cycles funds. If the answer is yes, move to the next step and address credit card or other retail debt or consumer debt, right? Because at this point, someone has an emergency fund, they're contributing to their TSP, and it's invested. And so now you can start addressing things like debt or whatever the next level is. And again, we're using TSP terminology, but this applies in terms of planning into a 401k or wherever the case may be. Same principles. These are all available. So just reach out to us and we can provide them. So I won't go step by step through all of them. But after you've done sort of that level 1 that we just looked at, there are sort of the next things to think about. Okay, do you have extra income? Are you maximizing accounts? Did you open that taxable account for goals that are on this side of retirement, those intermediate term like we talked about? Do you understand your tax situation? Once you knock through this, so if you made it through this or have done all these things, you already know they have an emergency fund. You know that you're contributing to your retirement accounts. You've knocked out your debt. You've created discretionary income to invest in other places, whether it's maximizing IRAs or a taxable account, and you understand your tax picture. If you were to do all those things at some intermediate stage of life, I would say you're probably on the right track. And then the last one just gets a little bit more advanced, maybe a little bit later in life or career, when you're thinking about things like mortgages and life insurance, trust and estate and your will, all critical things. But this sort of the next level of these things. So again, these are available to you. We have these flow charts as well as some kind of checklists that coincide with them. Now, the next step of execution, and this is new that Three Rangers Foundation is offering, and I'm pretty excited about it. This is the assess phase. If you go to that website there, financialwellness.threerangersfoundation.org, you'll see this sign up here. And what this provides is a couple of things, a bunch of tools and resources, which we'll talk about here in a second, calculators, articles, courses, the stuff to kind of prep you, equip you, and educate you on all things sort of financial, right? And you can sign up and you can take an assessment and answer a few questions and really get as deep into, you could build a budget through this thing and categorize expenses, track them, put them in there. And it gives you a feedback mechanism that's pretty powerful in terms of different things, right? So what's your overall score? Real easy to understand. 50 on retirement means I probably need to improve that a little bit. 100 on insurance means I'm sufficiently covered with life insurance or homeowners insurance, wherever the case may be, right? So by going through the assessment, you're going to get this sort of evaluation and feedback, and then you'll have all the tools and resources that you can look at to improve where you need to improve and maximize where you can maximize, right? There's a number of tools and calculators, a number of courses, a number of articles. Those are all available from this first sort of homepage. When you get to this page in the top right, you'll see resources. If you were to click on that, that would bring you to look at all these tools and calculators. The point being, you can take the assessment. This is available to all active duty Rangers, former Rangers, or Rangers going through the Ranger for Life program, completely free. You can take the assessment and get some of that feedback, or you can just take a look at the courses and the calculators and other tools. So this is fresh off the press and available to everybody if you go take a look at that website. Other resources, just educational resources that personally I like. I was broke, now I'm not.com is a personal financial planning website, and the guy has a book as well. His name is Joe Sangol, but this is similar to like a Dave Ramsey philosophy, but I think it's a little more achievable or a little more practical rather than kind of putting money in an envelope. The principles are the same, right? Categorizing the dollars and spending them intentionally on what you want and need to spend them on. But this is just another system like that. Nerdwallet.com is a great place for learning what's going on in personal finances, things like interest rates, mortgage rates, and just being up to speed on some of those things. For me, being up to speed on what's going on in the economy and current events at large is a big one. So my preferred is Wall Street Journal. All I'd say is make sure you have, a broad array of media sources these days. Couple of books. These are sort of tried and true classics. I Was Broke, Now I'm Not was that first one that I mentioned about financial planning that coincides with that website. And then the rest of these here are classics that are going to give you, insights, some education. A Random Walk Down Wall Street is a great one that teaches you how the stock market functions, how it behaves, especially in the short term, which is basically random. Everyday Millionaires is one that shows that the little things that you do build over time. The Millionaire Next Door is a classic. There's a statistic that the profession with the most millionaires, take a guess, it's actually teachers, not because they make the most, but because they tend to be frugal and intentional with their finances. So driving that 10-year-old Toyota that's completely paid off has its financial benefits, and that's sort of what Millionaire Next Door is. Richest Man in Babylon is very much a psychology or the way we think about money behaviorally, but great books there. So with that, I'm going to jump over here to the chat. See what questions that we have. Home ownership and real estate in general is part of financial or individual readiness. Yeah, so real estate. When it comes to real estate, buying your home and living it, living in it is a good investment. What I tell people when it comes to that, especially on the family planning side, is don't try to get cute about, okay, I shouldn't buy a house yet because I think rates may be going down, or I think the market will be going down. I'm going to wait for a market pullback. That almost never works out well for people because no one can predict those things. So what I tell people on the family planning side is find the home that's right for your family, right? So in my case, on paper, I would say that I overpaid for the current home that I live in 2021 because there are some very specific things I needed for my family. I have a daughter in a wheelchair, so there are some very specific, hard to find things that I needed. So I made sure I got it right now. I did it smartly with the down payment and getting a good VA mortgage. And, over time, the market has increased, so it's worked out fine. But my point is, when it's family planning, find the right home for your family. You do want to be financially smart about it, make good decisions. But that's kind of number one. From there, when it comes to either, okay, I'm going to move and rent out the last one, or even more so with buying separately, real estate, that's very easy to understand. It's been very popular for a long time. It's a little bit more difficult right now with where interest rates are. But I think the point is people overlook some of the risks in that if that house goes unrented or the market declines and you have two mortgages, can you withstand that? Right. So real estate in and of itself is risky. I'm not saying avoid at all costs. I'm just saying that's sort of a graduate level evaluation as far as it goes. Most people, especially if they're going to own their own home, that's their largest asset anyway. So there's a concentration kind of consideration as well. Good strategy to
Yeah.
pay. Yep. So major.
Hey Jeff. Hey
Oh yeah.
Jeff. It's Jeremy. Hey,
Hey.
I think the life lessons I learned and what you're talking about is that emergency funding, planning, and everything. Divorce hit me really hard, and I had to take that TSP, a lot of it out for my TSP to pay for that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like one of those emergency funds that I've learned the hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, when it comes to something like divorce or health issues or death in the family, sometimes we can't anticipate those and sometimes we can't see them coming. But the idea here is what I can do is make sure that I'm already, behaving in the right way. What I mean by behaving is I'm saving, I'm investing in such a way that when life throws us these curveballs, I mean, in that case, yeah, divorce and you have to cut your TSP in half, that's painful. But if you've built up and there's something there to split in half, then you're still left with something, right? Or you start over and you start building those practices. Ultimately, we can't control what happens in the economy or always in our health or always in our, relationships and things like that. It's all about putting yourself in the position to withstand those things as best you can effectively. So one question here, is it a good strategy to pay your mortgage principal in addition to making a monthly mortgage payment? That is a good strategy. Um, I get this question a lot, and typically my first question is what is the interest rate? Because if you had a mortgage from before 2022 and your interest rate is 3%, I would be less in a hurry to pay it off because that's practically free money, and you can use the extra money to invest in something that is likely to out earn 3%, right? Just as a consideration. Now, mortgage rates are not the case. So, definitely putting extra payment towards your mortgage is a good idea. However, I will point out that the time horizon piece becomes a piece of it too, right? So, I don't usually advocate someone, pour every penny that they have to pay it off, kind of like a Dave Ramsey. This is where I would disagree with him about living like you're poor until you're completely out of debt. And that's two reasons. One is if you're house poor, meaning you have no retirement assets, you have no savings, you have no money in the bank because you've put it all into the house, that's great. You have a lower mortgage. But if trouble comes along, you lose your job or have health issues, you can't buy groceries with home equity, right? So liquidity is something to keep an eye on, and that's that shorter time horizon thing. So that's the other thing I just point out to people to keep in mind. it's a good goal to have. So build that into your goals, and that can be part of it. But you should still be saving. You should still be investing, and that sort of thing. So I Major put this link here in the chat. Check it out. Ranger Investors that aims to power members of the 75th Ranger Regiment to build wealth through real estate. So good resource there to learn more about the real estate side of things. Anything else here? So I'll go to the next slide here. Just in summary, think long-term, define success, set the conditions, build that plan, plan to put yourself in a position to succeed, and then take advantage of these resources that we have that we're providing here, and execute. This is my contact information. I think everyone's going to have it on account of being a part of this brief anyway. But I appreciate your time. I hope you found this useful, and I'm available to serve as a resource to everybody however I can.
Jeff, thank you very much for the time you took to put into this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Again, this was a wide group of current guys and veterans guys. We try to make a little bit of balance, but we do have a lot of guys out there that are willing to, former Rangers that are financial advisors willing to provide, some advice on where you are. I mean, it's not completely, what you would normally pay for financial advisors, but there are a lot of guys that would help you say, hey, this is where you are. This is where I think you should point. But it's just sort of the unwritten rule that, we ask guys not to sell their own products, because then that would sort of violate, the Ranger Buddy rule that this whole process, go. But this will be posted on the Three Rangers Foundation Financial Wellness site probably within a week. If anybody wants to reference it, and down at the bottom it'll say, how to contact us. So I hope, I think we only dropped one person since we started, so I guess we reached the audience. And if anybody has anything else or any suggestions on how to make this better, please reach out to me. And because we're always looking to make it better, and to make it more relevant to Rangers and their families. So thanks everybody, and have a good night. Thanks again, Jeff. Great job.